Dr. Chuck the Science Schmuck.
Is it gonna keep working? Because I filmed this like 4 or 5 times now, going through my whole hyperactive caffeine spiel, and I have to go to work tomorrow. So, alright. Let's hope that the camera stays running and that whoever has the remote control stops messing with me. Stop messing with me. Gotta talk to my cameraman, but I don't have one. Carp are kind of gross looking and weird. I like them, but they're big and scary and they'll eat you. Ponds evolved into bowls. Not in the bowls of the traditional sense. They're more of a development of the 1950s. Large, broad porcelain bowls that were designed to display fish indoors as like a formal pond, kind of temporarily. Those got bigger and bigger and eventually became what we think of as a modern fish bowl. In a sense. You can go to Reddit and they'll tell you how bad fish bowls are, and I can tell you how bad fish bowls are, but I think you already know. Fish bowls originally were much larger. It's simply a matter of getting well-sealed glass, and they would contain an entire ecosystem, numerous plants, a small number of fish, and sediment to maintain, life, not tiny little things that you sell kids to put goldfish in, which goldfish don't really work well in, but, to be honest, I can tell you the reason for that. Goldfish are cheap. You can get feeder goldfish for like 15 cents. That's what kids do. They have their tiny little bit of kid money, and they're like, oh, I want a fish. Well, all I can afford is a glass bowl the size of this jar and a 15-cent fish, and it's going to die in a month. But people kind of consider most pets disposable, unfortunately. This became very popular in like the Victorian era, especially in the United Kingdom and later in Germany, where people started making aquariums, and the aquarium evolved substantially to the point where some of the earliest aquariums that you see for like personal use were wood. Because I was going to say because they had a lot of wood in that era, but I'm thinking Russia, which is basically solidly made of wood. The UK doesn't have wood anymore because they cut it all down to make fish tanks. Walls, back, wood. Bottom, slate. Front, glass. Top is open because that's how you get the fish in. Slate on the bottom. You say, why slate? Not just glass or wood on the bottom? Because that's where you light the fire under to heat the aquarium. Slate bottom aquariums, heated by fire, probably until the 1950s. That evolved over time. Probably around the turn of the century, you had like glass paneled, pretty ornate tanks. The water was stationary functionally. There wasn't things like filters. You had to build a precision ecosystem. You had to have your plants, you had to have a small number of fish, a good body of sediment, and you had to maintain that water pretty sturdily over time. Did I just see something move? I hope not. So that's sort of where you see an eventual shift is we got the glass aquariums, we started getting equipment to maintain them around the 1950s, and that's where saltwater for home use started to become possible. It existed previously, but it would be giant institutional aquariums that basically sucked in seawater and you had to just flow it. The ability to put equipment on your aquarium that could maintain it with electricity was very novel, and that made a lot of difference. Even just simple stuff like early under gravel filters, which filter water through the gravel for biological filtration. Putting those little filters on the back, which is now preferable, like the mid-tier range for filtration, that was new. The idea of an electric aquarium heater was new. And that's kind of where saltwater for personal use came in. And there's two reasons why maintaining saltwater is very difficult. The first is a pond is a pond. It's self-contained. All of the stuff that goes on in a pond functions in an ecosystem. It always has. It's all self-contained within that pond. Plants, bacteria, fish, other animals. It's all there. And it works. Everything tolerates everything else and it keeps running. An aquarium is a tiny segment of the ocean. The ocean is very big and it interacts with itself. So, like you're taking a piece of a coral reef and trying to put it in a glass container that is not connected to the ocean. That's very challenging because it's not designed like a pond. It produces waste products that would normally diffuse out into the ocean. Plankton would eat them. There's marine snow falling down on the bottom of the ocean, which is a place I hope not to go, but probably a place I will end up at some point in my life. Hopefully not the last point in my life. Irrational fears of water aside. The fact that it interacts with this giant ocean kind of makes it hard to separate a piece. Like a pond is naturally separated, but a piece of a coral reef is not separate from the entirety of the ocean. And you can't replicate like a deep water ocean in your house. That requires a lot of equipment. It requires a lot of specialized filtration, a lot of specialized operation to do that. But the bigger reason why there weren't aquariums, at least from what my understanding of aquarium history is, they couldn't build a structure that could hold salt water successfully. And that seems absurd, but you have to remember, the 1950s, there wasn't technology to the degree we think of. We think of it as modern. It was not modern. It was banging rocks together in almost every aspect of life. They could build a primitive gasoline engine, and that's about it. Maybe a computer that runs on gears. It's basically the steampunk ages in the 1950s. They had the ability to assemble a glass box, but the box could only be held together with metal, because they had a lot of that back then. And metal and salt water don't mix, so it would corrode the support structure for the aquarium eventually, and the whole thing would just fall apart. So it's difficult to contain the actual salt water. And then somebody invented, silicone, and suddenly we get all glass aquariums. And that changed everything. But the point is that it's an intersection of two different cultures. You have this very long culture of 100 years of, let's put it in a jar and try to balance, I don't know, there's fish, I guess. To, okay, this is the hardest thing in the world. It's trying to maintain this little marine ecosystem. We're going to put every ounce of our scientific prowess into maintaining it with all of this gear and stuff. And they don't really mesh necessarily at the middle. The thing is, though, do you really need all of that scientific mumbo-jumbo? You say, well, aren't you a scientist? No, I'm a guy who stole this lab coat and wear it pretty often because it doesn't have real pockets. What people found with a lot of aquariums in saltwater is that you can sequentially reduce the amount of equipment you have if you consider the fact that the biological system of the aquarium with the mixture of algae and microorganisms actually plays a substantial role. Remember, in the 1950s, they weren't too bright. They thought bacteria were bad, so they wanted everything sterile in an aquarium, which does not work. The bacteria are probably the primary focus of the aquarium. They keep everything running. Bacteria run everything. And we kind of understand now that we are just sacks to carry around bacteria. At least I am. That brings me, after all this babbling, because you have to remember, I once drunk from a babbling brook, and I gained the ability to babble. Regardless of that, I babble a lot, and I babbled a lot about a bunch of stuff, not doing anything interesting except drinking coffee, to explain that a basic level saltwater aquarium is about as difficult as an intermediate level freshwater aquarium. And what does that mean? Those words don't really matter. The answer to intermediate is, if you are not a 10-year-old, I mean, there's some pretty smart 10-year-olds, so I'm sure there's some intermediate level 10-year-olds, even advanced level 10-year-olds, but if you have ever had an aquarium before and actually kept it running, you're an intermediate freshwater aquarium person. Basic saltwater means there is crazy stuff you can do in saltwater. If you want to grow some ridiculous, really tough, hard corals, or you want to have a garden of sponges, or you want a sea cucumber. Oh boy, sea cucumbers. Oh, you're gonna need high-level stuff. But if you want to run just a small aquarium with a clownfish and a couple rocks and maybe oh, I'm coughing. It'll happen if you drink too much coffee. If you just want to have a clownfish, it's no more difficult than running a reasonably interesting freshwater aquarium with a few different considerations, but it's really the same difficulty. So what am I doing? What is the objective of this video? The objective of this video is my own amusement, frankly, but that's how the sausage is made. The sausage is actually made from the sausage trees. I've seen them. They are real. You can look it up. Sausage comes from sausage trees. I've seen sausage trees in Florida before they kicked me out of Florida. That's a joke. I wasn't kicked out of Florida, but I did have an ancestor who was kicked out of Canada, and that's why I'm American. So what I'm trying to do here is kludge together a cheap, not the cheapest possible, but basically make an aquarium out of solid schmuckery and spare parts that holds a saltwater ecosystem. Is that possible? The answer is yes. Maybe. I'll know by the end of the video, I guess. You'll know by the end of the video. It hasn't happened yet. I haven't done it. What, though, is the first thing we need? Well, the first thing we need is an aquarium. This is an aquarium. It's a really gross used aquarium. Used by me. I've used it a lot over the past 20 years. It's empty right now, mostly. Can't have that. No steel parts. That'll rust. The rest, glass. All glass. Ooh, spiders. It's even made by someone, but I don't know who. Usually these all glass brand have a tag in the bottom that says who made it. the assembler at the factory. This one is pretty gross, but it's fine, I think. Yeah, I'll figure out a way to clean it out eventually. This is 10 gallons. One important consideration of gallonage is that the bigger the aquarium is, the easier it is to maintain. That seems counterintuitive, but you have less volume that can shift suddenly. So temperature changes are slower, pH changes are slower, everything's slower. 10 gallons is a good size for a starter aquarium in freshwater. It's okay sized for saltwater, although frankly, not ideal in most cases. If you want to have saltwater fish, I'd go at least 30 to start with. It makes it easier. You can do 10 gallons if you know what you're doing. 10 gallons is also heavy. 10 gallons is 40.1 liters, which means it's 40 kilograms, which means it's about 100 and something pounds, which if you're British means you're rich. I actually saw the currency exchange rate the other day and got very sad that my dollars are now worthless. But that's okay. We're all going to be switching to rubles soon anyway. Not Russian rubles, like I'll be minting my own schmuck rubles. So a consideration for aquariums is they're heavy. 100 pounds. If you can sit on it, it'll hold an aquarium. So 10 you can kind of put on wooden furniture, but remember it's a weight that's going to be there for 10 years. It'll eventually break through. An aquarium stand is better. If you can get it, go with an aquarium stand. They're expensive, but it's better than having this thing fall through. Second consideration of an aquarium is the substrate, the substratum, the substrute, the stuff that goes in the bottom, which, So the substrate you usually see in aquariums is gravel. You can use that gravel just fine in a saltwater aquarium if you want to, but I always find the aquarium gravel too expensive. And it does raise an interesting scientific perspective. If you go out into the ocean and you stick your hand down in the bottom, I mean, not the bottom where like there's those weird eels that like go for your butt. Like just a regular waist deep water, which there are weird things in waist deep water, but we're not gonna get into that. Oh, flashbacks to the Gulf of Mexico. Stick your hand down. What do you find? Sand. Silica sand. That's present everywhere. Me, I grew up in Rhode Island, so if I go out into the ocean and I reach my hand down, I get rocks. That is not used in modern aquariums, almost ever. Sometimes in freshwater, never in saltwater. You say, why do we not use sand in aquariums? The answer is silicates. Sand is made of silica, which is silicon oxide. In freshwater, it doesn't do much. It's sort of inert. Under fresh, neutral acidic conditions, it's fine. Basic conditions, as you get higher up, seawater is about 8 to 8.5 pH. It starts to dissolve. Releases sodium potassium silicate. Probably calcium silicate too, but I think that's insoluble. That sort of floats in the water column and is fuel for diatoms, which are a form of algae that has a beautiful silica skeleton. Not that you can see it, it's microscopic. They form a sort of brown slime on things. You know, for some reason, most people don't like diatoms, and I say, what's wrong with diatoms? Like, I like having algae. It's nice, it's pretty. I like knowing that they're tiny creatures. I don't mind them. I don't see why people mind them so much, but usually people do not use silica sand. They use aragonite. What is aragonite? Aragonite is basically pulverized coral. So they take coral and they grind it up. It's dead coral. It's been dead for millennia, and they grind it up into a pulp, like a little powder, sometimes all the way down to sand. And that's more what you would see in a coral reef. Like coral reefs are made out of that. What is it chemically, though? You don't care where it comes from. Calcium carbonate. That's what coral skeletons are made out of, because our ocean is incorrect right now and will soon be shifting back to the correct form of being acidic, as it should be back in the age when I was born in the Carboniferous period, when it was just full of jellyfish. And fungus. Ocean fungus. It doesn't exist anymore very much, but that was a thing back in the day. So the thing is, aragonite's actually expensive, and I don't like spending money. So what are we using instead? Rocks. Specifically these little Vigoro rocks I got at Home Depot. Is this Vigoro? No. This is hailstone? Is that a... Okay, whatever it is. Decorative stone. I spent probably an hour and a half agonizing over what color stone to choose. It came down to either between this gray, which I think has a nice subtle, subdued nature to it. It's very gritty, as would be expected. Or the red stone, which is sort of a red sandstone, which is nice. Silica base, but with grains this big, the level of dissolution you're going to get is basically negligible. Very little surface area versus sand. Also a lot of area to develop those nice bacteria which will filter the aquarium passively. I also considered, I was sitting there in front of the marble. Marble is interesting. What is marble made out of? Calcium carbonate. Well, isn't that what aragonite's made out of? Yes, they're made of the same thing. You could basically produce the same pH effect by using marble, but I don't know if it's a great idea. So I chose these standard, I don't know what type of stone it is, I haven't washed them off. I think they're quartzite. That'll be the substrate for the aquarium. It's cheap, only costs $4.50 for this big old 14 liter. That can't be right. 0.5 cubic feet is 14 liters. It's real heavy. I think this is like a 50-pound bag. So it didn't cost 50 pounds in the British sense. It cost like $4. So very cheap. Almost bought the big round stones, but they were $10. That's too expensive. I'm not spending $10 on a saltwater aquarium. So the first step in the making of the aquarium is to get these into a colander and wash the dirt off so they're nice and pretty. So I'm going to go figure out how to do that. I need to find a colander or a sieve or some such similar to that. And there I have it. In fact, I didn't use a colander. I got to use a bowl because I had a bowl and I didn't want to ruin my colander because that's what I used to strain my sketties. Interestingly enough, the material in question has a much more igneous character than I had thought. Not gritty at all. Doesn't taste like anything. Quartz is predominantly in here. Oh, also I got this lid at Home Depot. It's plexiglass. Lexan acrylic? Not Lexan. Lexan's expensive. This was actually kind of expensive. It was about $7. I could get the same size piece of glass for $2. But the reason why do you get this? I don't intend to cut it. Acrylic is actually really hard to cut. The reason I get it is this. Ooh. My hand would be gone if that was glass. Because if you use glass, you're going to cut your bass. Sea bass, because it's salt water. See, these are chunks of rock. Now the aquarium doesn't look totally clean. Doesn't smell totally clean either. Not great. But we'll solve that problem when we get to it. The lid will fit here. That'll be our lid. Instead of buying a fancy lid, you may notice the lid is lacking over here. That's not lacking, that's on purpose. You'll see why once we get to the chapter on accoutrements. But first, there's now consideration for the juice. And what do I mean by juice? A light just turned on somewhere outside. It's not my light, so it's not my problem. Just like how those, what was I talking about? I don't know, it's a different day than it was before. But I don't know if it's actually the same day. It's weird, time is weird. It's not exactly, why is it a weird like fairy circle? Okay, focus. 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 What was I talking about? The juice is the salt water. How do we make the salt water? Well, that's what I'm about to learn yet. Okay, making the juice. The juice in the case of a saltwater aquarium is salt water, which requires two primary ingredients, salt and water. But that's a lot more complicated than it sounds. So, first of all, salt is not this salt. Don't do that. This is the salt you need. This salt's super old. You don't really need this much of it. I just had a big bag. Oh man, it's all greasy and wet because it's been in a garage for like 5-10 years. Doesn't smell like anything, but it sure has absorbed a lot of liquid in its existence, so it's not gonna be the best, but I do think it will be adequate for these purposes. Aha, salt. Now, you may be asking, why is this salt special? The answer is, this is instant ocean aquarium salt. It is designed to have all the ingredients that you would find in the ocean. So not just sodium chloride, but also potassium chloride, carbonates, just about everything you could, it burns. Well, I just got nutrition. Basically, the ocean contains salt, but it is not table salt. It's a mixture of different salts that need to be mimicked in your salt mixture. You can go to the ocean and get ocean water if you want to, but I don't live near the ocean. I live in New York, Syracuse, so I got synthetic salt, which you can get at any pet store. It goes into bucket. The bucket in this case is a clean, fresh, food-grade bucket. You have to be salt in the eye. You have to be careful with the buckets. The buckets you want are buckets that are clean, that have had no previous chemical exposure in them. That's going to need a few goodly chunks of salt. It's very chunky material. It comes in these big wads. In addition to salt, another consideration is the fact that this salt needs to be mixed with water. The water comes from pipes. You need dechlorinator. Unless you're using well water, in which case you may have other issues, but usually well water's fine. This stuff requires, what is this stuff anyway? Supposedly it's some kind of thiol? Smells like oil-based paint. Pretty much what it does is it removes chlorine from the water. You can't have chlorinated water or it's not going to work properly. How much do you need? Thodium thiosulfate. What's in it? Sodium thiosulfate, chelating compounds, polyvinyl pyroidones, organic hydrocolloids, minerals. Well, that's descriptive. Minerals. My hand really burns from this salt. That's probably bad. Let's see. The thiosulfate is the active ingredient. The thiol is a sulfur-containing group that binds to the chlorine and detoxifies it in a sense. Blah, 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 blah. Don't care. 10 milliliters for every 10 gallons. So this is a 5-gallon bucket. So we're going to want... what kind of a cap is this? Oh. Drop some of that in there. This stuff is the same for fresh or salt water. Doesn't really matter. Then you're going to need to apply some water. So, so once your salt is in, ooh, cold. Oh, that's really cold. It helps to mix it. Hands work okay. It's just seawater, really cold seawater. Oh no, it's reminding me of my homeland in coastal New England, where the ocean is always cold, but also very similar to the conditions in California, frankly. Now the question is, how do you measure the saltiness of water? And scientifically, that's a sort of interesting concept. Oh, it's heavy. This is super old. I've had it for years. A hydrometer. What does a hydrometer do? This is part where I have to be scientific because that's what you came here for, is science. Water has a density, right? The density of water is 1 gram per cubic centimeter, gram per milliliter, kilogram per liter. That's how heavy water is. Water has a specific density. Objects that are less dense than that float. Objects that are heavier than that sink. The hydrometer takes advantage of the fact that salt water is not the same density as regular water. It has salt in it, which results in it being denser. It's therefore heavier than water. So an object that sinks in normal water may float in salt water. You may have noticed this if you've ever swam. If you ever did swammed in the ocean versus a lake, you don't float so great on lakes usually, but you float real well on the ocean. And if you ever go out to like the middle of nowhere, wherever the Dead Sea is, I don't actually know, that's a super salty place. And if you try to swim in that, you just go bloop and float right to the top because it's so salty. The hydrometer has that needle, which is on a hinge. The needle has a little floaty in the middle. Under normal circumstances, that floaty isn't very buoyant, and if you just put this in normal water, it'll point at 1 for 0. If you put it in salt water, the salt water is heavier, so the needle is more buoyant and floats higher, pointing up to a rating of how salty the water is. And it's hard to tell on this older one, but this is the range you're looking for. You want the needle to go that high. So this will hopefully make a little more sense. I have 2 of these. So this one is filled with a sample of ordinary tap water at the same temperature. The hose is just staring me in the eye. It's filled with ordinary tap water at the same temperature as this salt water. You can see the needle points at 0. The water is not salty. This needle is floating a little higher. It is important to go through and check to make sure there's no air bubbles. I already did, tapped them out. There's no air bubbles attached to this float. This water is simply more dense. You may notice if you look at the sample that, you may not be able to see it, but it's still in the process of dissolving. Dissolving this stuff takes a while. It's not sodium chloride. Again, there's stuff in here that's not highly soluble. It takes a day or 2 to actually settle and mix up before you can really use it. It has precipitate, but even now, our saltiness range that we want to be in starts at 1.02 specific gravity. Which is a salinity of about 28 parts per trillion. I think that's what it says on the side, but I don't know if I believe it. So we want to get it up here in this range. Right now, this water's brackish. So this water would be great for having pufferfish or dragon gobies or mollies. Let's add a little more salt. Now, an interesting feature is that the water does, it's very subtle. It might even just be my brain tricking me. It has a different feel to it. It doesn't feel quite like fresh water. It feels heavier, because it is heavier per unit of volume, so that gives it a level of density that's greater. So we're still getting there. Not quite there yet. I kind of wonder what would happen if I just added salt straight to this thing. Oh, look at that. So I just put salt straight in the hydrometer, which means that if I plug it up and then give it a swirl, the needle starts going real high. See, needle just keeps going up. That salt's not wasted, it just goes back in here. I need a little bit more salt in the bucket. And there you have it. Fresh water, that this just was 5 minutes ago, and what it is now. It's actually a little bit above the saltiness. Nope, I was viewing it wrong. It is right the level of saltiness I need. The remainder part is to just let the rest of it dissolve slowly over the course of a few days. I wasn't going to set this up today anyway, it's the middle of the night. There is one test that I was curious about, though. Well, it tastes like the ocean and the hose, because it came out of a hose. It's fine, though. What was I doing? Well, I'm going to have to jump you forward a little bit because that's half of a 10-gallon fish tank, so I need to make more. I will put the fish tank in its location upstairs, and I will fill it, and then the next stage will be to get to with the life support accoutrements, and then the last segment will be actually stocking it. It needs a little more time, which for you will be a matter of seconds, but for me may take up to a week. Mainly because I have to order online. So I could set this thing up and have it running in 24 hours if I wanted to. But I'll take my time. I'm not in a hurry. I'd rather get everything set properly than rush it. I need to go do something about the fact that I just drank a small amount of synthetic ocean water. Something to consider about this much salt, though. Don't accidentally water plants with it. Don't spill it on anything. Oh. Don't let it touch anything metal, because it'll rust. Like my hand.